Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video, as part of our How to Paint Faces or Skin series, we're going to look at painting pale skin. Certainly in my opinion, one of the trickiest. We're going to take 3 paints and look at how we can make that skin really stand out on our characters, squad leaders and the like. To begin with, we're going to base coat the face using GW Rakarth Flesh. It's particularly important when we're using lighter coloured paints that we apply them in a few thin layers to make sure that we achieve a smooth base coat. I've worked over grey primer here, but you can use black, white, brown, whatever primer you like. And we just build it up until we got a decent base to work from. It doesn't have to be completely solid, but the paint's going to adhere much nicer over the top of this. Now I'm going to mix up our shadow colour. And I'm using Scale 75 African Shadow. It's one of my absolute favourite paints for painting skin with, and I use it in nearly every single tone that I will attempt. So I mix a little bit of that into the Rakarth Flesh and then thin it down a lot. Just with water. And now we start to apply those shadows. I'm not going to film the entirety of this face like I did in our first painting faces video, but I will show you most of it. But all I'm focusing on is if the light is shining on the model from above, which areas are going to be in shadow and which areas are going to be in light. The major difference here is if we were to just use a wash straight over this base coat, that would only make the very deepest recesses dark. It would leave everything else the same tone. And that's not what we're trying to achieve here. The areas that are going to be lightest are going to be the areas that are facing up towards the light. And therefore the areas that are going to be the darkest are those facing directly away from that light. Because we're using the paint at quite a thin consistency, it's important we don't have too much on the brush. So you can see on the cork, I've just touched off any excess on the brush. You can use a piece of paper, or you can do the classic painter's thumb. Whatever it is, it's just to make sure that when our brush touches the model, loads of paint doesn't leave it. And again, because we're using quite thin paint, it dries pretty quickly. So by the time I've worked around the face, I can go back to the original side and carry on, reinforcing the shadows. And you'll notice with my brush, I'm always moving it towards the shadow. This means that I'm going to deposit the majority of the paint where my brush leaves the model, so in this case in the shadow. Pale skin for me's certainly been one of the more challenging ones to paint. But I came upon this recipe when I was doing some Night Lords. I really like it, and I think it works great for things like Night Lords, Ravenguard, Dark Eldar, ghouls, zombies, anything like that. And whilst you may think this is a little bit more work than just slap a base coat on and put a wash on, when we talk about army painting, we're talking about taking real pride in what the miniatures look like as a whole, but also individually. So with a lot of ranges, there's not a huge amount of bare heads or flesh on show. So where there is, it's nice to take a little bit more care with it. If I was doing something where the majority of the model was skin, I'd still be using the same recipe, but I'd be using perhaps an airbrush to get that base coat down, and maybe even an airbrush to get that first shadow down. And again, if it takes a little bit longer, it's not really the problem if it's covering the majority of the model. Now we need to start blending those layers together. So I've gone back here to my Rakarth Flesh, and I'm just working in the little area between where the darker African Shadow is and my original layer of Rakarth Flesh is. And all we start to do is glaze and blend them together. If you want to take a look just about using glazing to blend, we've done a video using power swords. It's a nice simple demonstration. You'll have noticed in this video and in the other ones to do with painting faces, we don't worry about being super neat to begin with. We concentrate on getting the areas of light and shadow in, and then we tidy the model up. That bottom bit of the jaw there, it's important we light that back up because it does move slightly outwards and therefore is going to catch the light more. Now you can see I'm having a little bit of trouble blending the little line we've got there between the temple and the top of the head. This is because I'm using a very thin actually, glaze of the lighter colour. It's always going to be more difficult doing that over the dark. So what I've done now is I put a little drop of the African shadow into that mix, and now I'm glazing the opposite way. So I'm starting in the light area, moving into the dark area, and it blends it much quicker. Now I go back to pure African shadow. I'll just do a couple of those deepest recesses. So his ear, round his eye sockets, paint his lips in. But we're still using just a couple of paints. Using the wet palette really helps for this. Stops them drying out, allows us to keep working with our little mixes. And then we want to paint in his scar as well. This heads off the Dark Angel's Primaris character, by the way. Now for our highlight, we're going to use Vallejo, Model Colour, Basic Skin Tone. So here I'm going in and just focusing on those prominent areas that will catch the light. So his brow, bridge of his nose, his upper lip, top of his cheekbones. Seems like Space Marines always have super sharp cheekbones. Make sure we get his ears as well. And if you think the basic skin tone on its own is a little bit too bright, you can always just mix in a little bit of that original Rakarth Flesh. But again, I'm using a relatively thin mix of this, probably 50-50 paint to water. So generally, one coat of that isn't going to make an enormous difference, so the change shouldn't be too profound. But I love this step, or this stage rather, of the paint job. It very, very quickly suddenly comes together. I really, really like how this head's turning out. I think I'll probably stick it on something in my army. You can see, even though he's a real pale skin tone that we want on this, actually an awful lot of the head is that much darker African shadow colour. But when we look at it, we still go, oh, that's really anemic, that's a really pale skin tone. It can get a little bit overwhelming at this stage, so what I've done is painted all the other details in black. This just helps outline things, it creates a bit more definition, and at this stage we can now see the areas that we need to touch up. But I've done absolutely nothing else to this face other than paint in those details in black since the last frame. For his right eye, I used an off-white colour. It was a pale blue-grey, because I assume with the scar running through it, he's maybe blind in that eye or something. So I'm still working on the model here with the basic skin tone. just refining it now. The vast majority of the work's done. And I'd anticipate total paint time so far on this model's been around maybe 15 minutes at most, probably nearer 10 minutes. Was just struggling to get the brow how I wanted it, but we're pretty much there. Here's the finished head. Now on its own, it looks pretty cool, but let's pop it on a model and see it in situ. So I think we've got a really fantastic result from 3 paints and not a lot of time. So we've now covered a basic Caucasian skin tone, a basic black skin tone, and a basic pale skin tone. If there's others you'd like us to look at, let me know in the comments and we'll get to those. And I'm also going to do a video looking at how, if the majority of the model is skin, how do we approach it differently to just doing a face or something like that. Thanks very much for watching. If you've enjoyed it, hit the like button. If you want to see more from us, make sure you hit subscribe and hit the notifications bell. And I'll see you next time.